Few franchises have managed to capture the hearts of so many gamers quite like Elder Scrolls games have. It's easily one of the most popular and influential RPG franchises ever. But despite its immense popularity, most people wouldn't be able to list all of the games in the series off the top of their head. And considering that not all of them are RPGs, this is quite understandable. So if you'd like to learn about or just brush up on the entire journey of the franchise, stick around because we'll be listing every game from Arena to Blades. If you thought Skyrim was the last Elder Scrolls game, then buckle up, because we'll be mentioning all of the spin-offs as well. So without any further ado, let's begin. First up, we have the Elder Scrolls Arena, which debuted way back in 1994 for the MS-DOS. This was actually the first RPG that Bethesda has ever made, but it wasn't initially supposed to be an Elder Scrolls game. The game was envisioned as a gladiatorial arena game, but sometime during development, the devs decided to make it into an open-world RPG that would revolve around quests, and slapped the Elder Scrolls onto the title. Now, Arena is very different from the modern mainline Elder Scrolls games. For starters, you aren't given just a region of the world to explore, but the whole continent of Tamriel. The world of Arena actually spans around 6 million square miles. But while the world was simply immense, it was also entirely procedurally generated, meaning that the Tamriel you may have experienced was entirely different from the one experienced by your friends. Nevertheless, Arena was very popular, so much so that it demanded a sequel. The Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall was released just 2 years after Arena. However, it wasn't just a sequel for the sake of having a sequel. No, Daggerfall did a lot of things right that we have to keep in mind when looking at the franchise as a whole. For example, it limited the player to High Rock and a portion of Hammerfell. As such, the world of Daggerfall was much smaller than the one from the Arena, but it was also much more consistent. Because of the smaller size, which, by the way, isn't at all small, coming in at just over 160,000 square kilometers, the devs could make the world much more detailed and much more alive than before. It was the first time all fans got to experience the same world in an Elder Scrolls game. And the innovations didn't stop there. In Daggerfall, you could own property, join a guild, create your own spells, and so much more. Given that it is an MS-DOS game, we can't say that it aged well or that you should go play it. But looking back, at least we can see that from the very start, Bethesda made sure to make every Elder Scrolls game better than the last, which we don't get from many developers nowadays. Or at least let's just agree that Bethesda made sure to make every mainline Elder Scrolls game better than the last. Spin-offs are the exception, and just the naming convention of an Elder Scrolls legend, Battlespire, is enough to let you know that you're dealing with a spin-off. Now, for what it's worth, Battlespire wasn't outright a bad game. It just didn't have anything to do with the Elder Scrolls games on a mechanical level. The game takes place in Battlespire, a battle mage training fortress in the Daedric realm of Oblivion. It features closed levels, no open world, no merchants, and no currency. It was the first Elder Scrolls game to feature online multiplayer, but this didn't make it any less unremarkable. The Elder Scrolls Adventures, Redguard, was another spin-off that didn't feature core Elder Scrolls gameplay. Essentially, Redguard is a pirate-themed action game that borrows a lot from the Prince of Persia games. Yeah, it takes place within the Elder Scrolls universe, but it also puts players in the shoes of a pre-made, non-customizable character named Cyrus. Again, not a bad game. In fact, it was fairly well received at the time of its release, but it's largely forgettable in the context of the franchise as a whole. But you know what? It's good that Bethesda didn't rush to make The Elder Scrolls 3 as soon as possible. It meant they had all the time in the world to make the next mainline game one of the best RPGs ever. Morrowind is one of the most beloved entries in the series and one of the best open-world RPGs ever created. The game takes place in Morrowind. In fact, it takes place in just a small fraction of Morrowind, about 24 square kilometers to be precise. But each square, nook, and cranny of these 24 square kilometers was meticulously handcrafted, making Morrowind the most interesting and immersive game world at the time. It also felt a lot larger than it really was, just because fast travel was not a thing in the game. Bethesda took what worked in Daggerfall and then streamlined and expanded upon it. Some features had to be cut just because they didn't fit into Morrowind's revised mechanics and fully three-dimensional world, but the game was by no means dumbed down. The only gripe some fans have with the game and returning to it is the dice-based combat that was retained from Daggerfall. Dice are incredible in tabletop games, not only because they're still the best form of analog RNG, but because they make you feel like you have agency. There's a tactile dimension to them. You feel like the way you throw them matters, and you understand, despite knowing better, that some dice are cursed and some are blessed. But having the computer roll the dice for you is just uneventful and tedious. Also, trying to hit a scrib 75 times and landing only 3 hits, that was kind of annoying, honestly. Still, this is only one criticism in an otherwise flawless game. And by the way, if you like playing games for their stories, then you'd be doing yourself a disservice by skipping Morrowind, since it has some of the best main quest lines in the entire franchise and 2 excellent expansion packs in the form of Tribunal and Blood Moon. The latter expansion added Solstheim to the game, an area with which you're probably familiar with. This is also the game that introduced modding to the Elder Scrolls games. So, in many ways, Morrowind is the quintessential Elder Scrolls game. Now, as we know, making sprawling open-world RPGs is a process that takes a lot of time and effort, but Bethesda didn't intend to waste that time, so while the new mainline Elder Scrolls game was being developed, they gave fans new spin-offs to play with. The Elder Scrolls Travels is actually a series of 3 games: Stormhold, Dawnstar, and Shadowkey, all of which were released for handheld consoles. Just in case you were wondering which handheld consoles, the first 2 games were released for J2ME and Brew devices, while Shadowkey was released for Nokia's Engage handheld. In case you've never heard of any of these, don't worry, you didn't really miss anything. Handheld devices were way more limited in terms of hardware than they are now, so these games were doomed from the start. Thankfully, it didn't take Bethesda an entire decade to release the next mainline Elder Scrolls game. The Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion was released in 2006, just 4 years after Morrowind. It took place in the Imperial province of Cyrodiil, an idyllic heartland province that pushed the 2006 hardware to its limits. Like all previous Elder Scrolls games, it didn't suffer from sequelitis. The devs made sure to not only streamline main existing features, but also add many more to make the game more accessible. One of the welcome additions was the voice acting. Oblivion was the first fully voiced Elder Scrolls game, although this can be seen as a double-edged sword, since there were far too few voice actors lending their voices to the many NPCs in the game. Regardless, it was definitely a step in the right direction. What's also great is that the RNG was finally removed from combat. However, despite the vibrant new world and plenty of cool side quests, Oblivion certainly had its fair share of shortcomings. For one, the world could feel bland and generic at times, especially the dungeons. Also, while the facial animations were great and still hold up, the facial expressions and how they chase one another across the faces of the NPCs is just weird. None of this makes Oblivion a bad game, but it does pile on as you spend more and more hours in-game. Still, the positives definitely outweigh the negatives. The story is amazing, the DLCs are incredible, and the game is just loads of fun to play. And then came Skyrim, a game that needs no introductions. Interestingly enough, we didn't get any spin-offs between Oblivion and Skyrim, not that that's a bad thing. At over 30 million copies sold, Skyrim is not only the best-selling Elder Scrolls game, but pretty close to the top 10 best-selling games of all time. It continued the process of streamlining and revising the game just as Oblivion did. Needless to say, the game had immense mainstream appeal. However, some of the changes introduced didn't really sit well with longtime fans of the series. For example, many frowned upon the game scrapping the traditional traditional RPG leveling mechanics in favor of a simpler perk-based system. This made the game feel more like an action game with RPG elements than a genuine RPG. But considering how well designed the world was and how much content there was, the changes to the leveling weren't enough to dissuade anyone from trying this game. In fact, we'd argue that Skyrim is the best Elder Scrolls game from a mechanical standpoint. The combat had never felt as fun and dynamic as it had in Skyrim, so the only point where we feel Bethesda really dropped the ball with Skyrim would be the quests. Yes, the world of Skyrim is immense and would take you hundreds of hours to go through all the content the game has to offer. And that's not even accounting for the 3 DLCs and all the community-made mods that are well worth your attention. But the main questline is incredibly weak when compared to the previous 2 mainline games, and even many of the side quests feel forgettable and inconsequential. If it sounds like we're bashing on Skyrim, that's not our intention. Sure, we like to joke about how the game has been re-released 4 times and counting as much as the next person on the internet, but there's a reason this game has endured the test of time so well. It's good. Now, while Skyrim may be the last mainline Elder Scrolls game for now, this doesn't mean that we haven't gotten a lot of Elder Scrolls games since. The first one was the Elder Scrolls Online, an MMORPG that finally lets you explore almost all of Tamriel. At the moment, the world of Elder Scrolls Online comprises of Cyrodiil, the Somerset Isles, Valenwood, High Rock, Skyrim, Hammerfell, Morrowind, and Black Marsh. Not all of these regions are available in their entirety, but if you want to experience more of Tamriel, no other game can offer as much of it as the Elder Scrolls Online, at least not in a manner that isn't procedurally generated. The game still has a healthy player base, so if you're itching for more Elder Scrolls and you haven't tried the MMORPG version of the game, it's not too late to give it a shot. The Elder Scrolls Online only caught the tail end of the MMO bandwagon when it was released back in 2014. Part of this is due to how long it takes to develop a fully fleshed MMORPG with a vast world and intricate mechanics. In all likelihood, the development on this game had probably started back during the heyday of MMOs, also known as the time when the Wrath of the Lich King was out. As for the digital card game trend, however, Bethesda managed to board that bandwagon relatively early. There isn't really a lot to say about the Elder Scrolls Legends. It's a collective card game. You've seen it all before. At the moment, the game averages less than 1,000 players on Steam. Way better than the Dead on Arrival artifact, but not something we'd recommend getting into at this point. If you're hungry for some card games, Hearthstone is still the most popular option, although Magic: The Gathering, the granddaddy of all card games, finally has an appealing and intuitive client in Magic Arena. We recommend going for either of these 2 if you need to scratch that CCG itch. And lastly, we have the Elder Scrolls Blades. Notice how we didn't say last but not least. Blades is a mobile game with a linear story and roguelike dungeon exploration gameplay. There's also heavy emphasis on PvP arena combat. It's not a bad game per se, it's just your average mobile game. However, the lack of innovation, limited gameplay, and loads of microtransactions just hurt way more when they're part of the Elder Scrolls legacy. And that about does it for the Elder Scrolls games we've had so far. We were hoping we'd get some news regarding the Elder Scrolls 6 at this year's E3, but all we've heard from Bethesda was that Blades is coming to the Nintendo Switch. At least one guy in the audience really enjoyed this announcement. But for now, we don't know anything about the next mainline game. The rumor mill has it that the most likely locations for it are either High Rock or Hammerfell, but you should take this with an entire pinch of salt. In any case, we hope you've enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you did, and maybe even share this video if you think it's something your friends ought to know about. Also, let us know in the comments which Elder Scrolls game is your favorite. Just remember to keep an open mind when commenting. More videos like this one are on their way, so if you don't want to miss them, be sure to click on the bell icon. In the meantime, Outlanders, may your games be fun and your losses few, and we'll see you next time on Gaming Scan.